On a gloomy day, as mourners gathered to say goodbye to Hannah, an unexpected disturbance shattered the solemnity. Her loyal dog, Duke, barked furiously at the casket, sensing a truth hidden from human eyes. As whispers spread and tension mounted, the funeral became a chilling scene of revelation. What was Duke trying to uncover? The sky was covered with thick clouds, mirroring the somber mood that enveloped everyone at Hannah's funeral. The air was heavy, thick with grief, as the village gathered in the cemetery. A hush had settled over the crowd, a respectful silence for the woman they had all loved in different ways. Faces were painted with sorrow, some shedding tears while others stood stoically, their thoughts lost in reflection. The wind blew softly, rustling the leaves of the trees, as if nature itself were paying its final tribute to the departed soul. The mourners, dressed in black, stood solemnly around the casket. Some grasped handkerchiefs, dabbing at their eyes, while others wiped their faces, remembering Hannah's warm laugh, her kindness, and her sharp wit. She had been a friend to many, a confidante to others, and a beloved figure in the village. The mood was heavy with quiet reflection as people clung to the memory of happier times. There was a sense of peace in the air despite the tragedy, and the scene appeared as though it would unfold like any other funeral, calm, respectful, and reverent. But then suddenly, the peace was shattered. A loud, frantic bark echoed through the air. The mourners turned, their eyes searching the cemetery for the source of the noise. There, standing at the edge of the gathering, was Duke, Hannah's loyal dog. The crowd knew him well. Duke was not just any dog. He had been with Hannah through thick and thin, a constant companion, a presence that could be felt in every corner of the village. But today his behavior was anything but normal. He stood rigid, his eyes locked onto the casket, his barking growing louder, more insistent with each passing second. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by an urgent, almost frantic energy. People exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to make of it. Was the dog in distress? Was he sensing something they couldn't? Duke's barking grew more intense, and the air seemed to thicken with unease. The mourners began to murmur amongst themselves. "What's gotten into him?" one whispered. "Why is he acting like this?" others asked. No one could explain it, and no one dared to voice the thoughts that were creeping into their minds. Could Duke be sensing something? Something beyond their understanding? Was there a hidden message, an unseen presence, something only the dog could perceive? The villagers had always known that Duke was no ordinary dog. There were whispers that he could sense things, things beyond the realm of human understanding. Some said he could detect changes in the weather before anyone else. Others spoke in hushed tones of his uncanny ability to sense the mood of those around him, to comfort someone before they even knew they needed it. But today, his actions were different, more desperate, more intense, as if he were trying to convey something important, something urgent. As his barking continued, a chill ran down the spines of the children in the crowd. Some of the adults, too, began to feel uneasy, recalling old stories from their youth, tales of animals that could sense things unseen by the human eye. Duke wasn't just barking for no reason, was he? Was he trying to communicate something about Hannah's passing? Was there something hidden that they weren't seeing? The atmosphere was tense, thick with uncertainty. Father Michael, standing at the altar close to the casket, took notice of the growing unrest in the crowd. He looked around, realizing that all eyes were now on him and the dog. Duke's insistent barking was impossible to ignore, and despite the priest's attempts to remain composed, his unease grew. He stepped forward, trying to maintain control over the situation, raising his hands in a gesture that would normally bring calm. "Please, everyone, settle down," he called out, his voice soft but firm, trying to reassure the mourners. "Let us focus on the ceremony." But Duke's barking continued, louder now, more frantic. The dog's behavior had clearly unsettled the crowd, and the air in the church was thick with tension. Father Michael felt the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, though he wiped it away quickly, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. "It's just a dog," he said, his voice tinged with a nervous laugh, attempting to shift everyone's focus back to the task at hand. The eulogy for Hannah, the final tribute to a life well lived. But even as he spoke, a part of him wondered if there was something more to Duke's behavior, something that no one could yet understand. His smile was forced, strained, and for the first time, he noticed that no one was paying attention to him. All eyes were still on Duke, who refused to stop barking, his gaze still fixed unwaveringly on the casket. It was as though Duke were trying to communicate something far beyond what any of them could comprehend. Father Michael, sensing that the situation was slipping out of his hands, approached Duke slowly. The dog, his tail rigid and his stance unwavering, continued to bark as if calling for attention. The priest knelt down, trying to calm the dog with a gentle voice. "Come on, Duke," he coaxed softly, reaching out to stroke the dog's head. "It's all right, Duke. Everything's fine." But Duke, sensing the priest's uncertainty, pulled back. His growl was low, a sound that reverberated through the air, sending a ripple of unease through the crowd. Duke's eyes never left the casket, and the priest, realizing his efforts were in vain, stood up quickly. His attempt at reassurance was failing, and he could feel the weight of the congregation's collective gaze upon him. They were all watching. Every move he made, every word he spoke, seemed to hold more weight now than ever before. The priest wiped the sweat from his brow, his heart racing. "It's just a dog," he repeated nervously, but his voice lacked conviction. His words hung in the air, but no one seemed reassured. In fact, the more Father Michael tried to dismiss the situation, the more it seemed that the crowd was growing suspicious. Why was he so eager to end this? Why did it feel like he was avoiding the dog's gaze? Was there something more at play here? The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "Does he know something?" someone whispered under their breath. "Why is he avoiding the casket?" another voice asked. The unease in the air became palpable, and Father Michael's discomfort was now visible to everyone. He realized that his attempts to control the situation were only making it worse. He needed to regain control, and fast. Father Michael's patience began to thin as the tension in the church grew heavier. His efforts to calm Duke had failed, and now he could feel the weight of the crowd's collective gaze. They were waiting for him to restore order, but instead, the priest felt himself growing more anxious. The whispers among the mourners had turned into audible questions. "What is Duke seeing that we can't? Why won't the priest do something? This isn't normal." The words were low but thick with suspicion, and they seemed to tighten around Father Michael's chest like a noose. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears. The quiet, respectful funeral he had hoped for was slipping away. Instead of paying final respects to Hannah, the mourners were now fixated on a dog and the strange spectacle it was creating. Father Michael stood, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his cassock, trying to hold himself together. It was then that David, a stranger who had recently moved to the village, stood up. He had been sitting quietly at the back, observing everything with an intensity that hadn't gone unnoticed. He wasn't like the other mourners. He wasn't connected to the village, and he didn't have the same vested interest in Hannah's passing. Yet, he had been oddly moved by the scene unfolding before him. David had always been an observant man, and his curiosity often led him down paths that others would rather ignore. Today, it led him to Duke. David, standing slowly, caught the attention of everyone in the church. His movements were calm, deliberate. He adjusted his coat, and the murmurs quieted as his presence filled the space. People wondered, who was this man, and why was he so bold? David was a newcomer, but there was something about the way he carried himself that demanded attention. There was an energy about him, a quiet certainty in his eyes. David was not the type to ignore an injustice or leave a mystery unsolved. "Hello, little friend," David murmured, his voice calm and steady as he approached Duke, who had stopped barking for a moment, but his eyes were still locked on the casket, filled with a strange mixture of fear and urgency. David crouched down next to the dog, speaking softly to him. "What are you trying to show us?" For a brief moment, Duke stopped barking. His intelligent eyes met David's, as if assessing this stranger before him. There was something in Duke's expression that communicated more than any bark ever could, something urgent, something pleading. David's heart quickened as the dog's gaze seemed to be asking him for help. Without hesitation, David turned to face the casket, following Duke's lead. His own instincts were telling him that there was more to this scene than anyone had realized. The crowd fell silent, watching as David and the dog stood motionless for a few seconds. David felt a chill run down his spine, an unshakable feeling that something was about to be uncovered. The murmurs in the congregation grew louder again, with some people uncomfortable and others intrigued. "Leave the dog alone," one man muttered from the back, his tone dismissive. "This is disrespectful. Let the priest do his job." David didn't flinch. Instead, he remained focused on the task at hand. "I think Duke is trying to tell us something," he said calmly. His words, though quiet, carried an unexpected weight. "And I think we should listen." Father Michael's face tightened at the words. He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing with a mix of discomfort and annoyance. His authority was being challenged by a stranger, a man he barely knew, and who, in his mind, had no business stepping into the middle of this sacred moment. "It's inappropriate to interfere with the service," Father Michael said, his voice wavering slightly as he looked around the room. He could feel the eyes of the mourners on him, weighing his every word. The dog's behavior had already begun to unravel the priest's composure. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew that it needed to stop before it turned into something uncontrollable. "Please calm the dog down," he insisted. The priest's words were a plea, but David's resolve didn't waver. "Maybe we should let the dog finish what he started," he said with a calmness that surprised even himself. "Perhaps there's something more here than we realize." Father Michael's hand twitched at his side. His gaze shot to David, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Was it fear? He quickly masked it with a nervous smile, trying to maintain control of the situation. "This is not the time for distractions," he said, forcing his words through clenched teeth. His voice wavered as he spoke, a nervous edge creeping into his tone. "Please, leave that dog alone. We are here to mourn." But David, sensing the priest's increasing agitation, wasn't about to back down. The dog's behavior, his unyielding focus on the casket, had ignited a sense of urgency in him. There was something more at play here, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. David wasn't afraid of confronting uncomfortable truths, and he could feel the priest's discomfort rising. Before anyone could stop him, David stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the casket. "Father," he said, his voice steady, "how exactly did Hannah die?" The question hit the room like a thunderclap. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd, and the murmurs quickly turned to gasps. The people were stunned. How could he ask such a bold, direct question at a time like this? Father Michael's face instantly turned pale. His eyes widened in disbelief, and the room fell into a tense, suffocating silence. "What do you mean? How did she die?" the priest stammered, his voice shaky. "I found her myself in her bed. She passed away peacefully in her sleep." "She died in her sleep," he repeated, the words coming out faster now, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. But David, unshaken, pressed on. "But why was Hannah alone? Why were you the first to find her?" His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, like a man who had just stumbled upon the first clue of a much larger puzzle. A chill swept through the room as the priest's words faltered. People exchanged uneasy glances, some starting to question the priest's version of events. There was a growing sense of discomfort in the air. David had pushed too far, and now the priest seemed desperate to dismiss the questions. "Doesn't that seem strange to you, Father?" David's voice was quieter now, but it carried a weight of suspicion that no one could ignore. Father Michael's expression changed. His eyes narrowed, and the nervousness in his voice was unmistakable as he snapped. "This is absurd." His face flushed with anger. "You're causing an uproar in the middle of a sacred moment, disrespecting the memory of someone so dear to all of us." He pointed a shaking finger at David. "Leave now, or I'll have you removed." The tension in the room reached its breaking point. David felt a rush of adrenaline as the priest's outburst echoed around the church. The entire congregation was watching, waiting for David's next move. He stood firm, refusing to back down. Father Michael's voice echoed through the church, his command ringing out with more authority than David had expected. The tension in the air became thick with uncertainty. The priest's face was flushed with anger, but there was something else, something darker lurking beneath his tone. His words, though harsh, didn't hold the same power they once did. The walls of his authority, once unshakable, were starting to crack. David stood still, unshaken by the priest's outburst. The weight of the situation settled over him like a heavy cloak, but there was no turning back now. His instincts told him he was right. There was something deeply wrong here, something that the priest was desperately trying to cover up. He couldn't let the mystery slip away. Not now. Not after everything Duke had revealed. Not after the strange unease that had gripped the congregation. "I think we need to know the truth, Father," David said, his voice calm but firm. "And I'm not leaving until we do." Father Michael's eyes darted around the room, his gaze filled with panic. For a brief second, David saw something flicker behind the priest's usually composed exterior, a fear that had not been there before. But before David could press any further, Duke let out a sharp bark, as if to punctuate David's words. The dog was still tense, his posture unwavering, and it was as though he were urging David to push on. The priest's face tightened in frustration, his knuckles white as they gripped the edge of the pulpit. He tried to regain control of the situation, but his hands trembled slightly. The room was growing heavy with suspicion, and the murmurs in the crowd were growing louder. A few of the older villagers began to exchange glances, their faces marked by unease. They had known Father Michael for years, but there was something about his reaction today that was out of character. Something was changing, and no one knew what would come next. As the air became increasingly thick with tension, David decided to take action. He turned toward the back of the church, his eyes scanning the room, searching for anything that could help piece together the puzzle. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and David knew that every second mattered. "I think the truth is in this church," David said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed room. "And I intend to find it." David didn't wait for the priest's response. Without another word, he started to move toward the back of the church. The crowd parted in silence, their gazes following him, unsure of what would happen next. David's steps were measured, deliberate, as he moved past the altar and toward a narrow side door that led to the church's storage area. The whispers grew louder as the villagers watched him, some of them already questioning the priest's behavior, others unsure of how to respond to David's boldness. The priest's eyes followed David, his face contorted with frustration and fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, David turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the priest's. "This is your last chance, Father," David said, his voice cold. "Tell us the truth, or I will." Father Michael's face went pale, and for a split second, David could see him wrestle with a decision. The priest's mouth opened, but no words came out. He was frozen, trapped between the overwhelming pressure of the situation and the dark secrets he was trying to keep buried. David didn't give him a chance to speak. He turned back and headed toward the storage area, the heavy silence in the church almost unbearable. The doors creaked open as he pushed them, the cool air of the back room hitting him like a wall. It was dark and damp, a place rarely visited by the congregation. But David had a feeling that the answers he was looking for were hidden right here. As he entered the storage area, Duke followed closely behind, his nose twitching, as if he, too, could sense that something was hidden in the shadows. The room was filled with dust, old boxes, and forgotten relics. But David didn't stop to examine the clutter. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the shelves and the corners of the room. It was then that David's gaze landed on something unusual. A small, weathered metal box tucked away in the back corner, half hidden behind a stack of old hymnals. His heart skipped a beat. This was it. The box Duke had been trying to draw his attention to. David crouched down and carefully pulled the box from its hiding place. He could feel his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to uncover. He opened it slowly, almost reverently, as though he were unearthing a hidden truth long buried beneath layers of secrecy. Inside, he found stacks of money, bundles of cash, all tied with labels indicating they were donations from the congregation. His eyes widened as he realized that this was no ordinary offering money. These were the donations that people had trusted the church with, money that was supposed to be used for good, for the community. But instead, it had been hidden away by someone who had betrayed that trust. David quickly closed the box and stood up, his mind racing. He knew this was only the beginning. There was more to this mystery, much more. But now he had the proof he needed. And with that proof, he could finally expose Father Michael's corruption to the world. David's heart raced as he carefully tucked the metal box under his arm, his mind working over the implications of what he had just uncovered. This wasn't just about the stolen money. This was about corruption that ran deep within the church, hidden from the community for years. Father Michael had woven a web of deceit so intricate, so well guarded, that it had taken Duke's strange behavior to bring it all to the surface. With Duke at his side, tail wagging in anticipation, David moved swiftly back to the church's main hall. The atmosphere had shifted from a solemn, respectful farewell to something more electric, filled with the kind of tension that only a great secret could cause. The murmurs from the crowd had grown louder, and a sense of urgency filled the air. People stood with bated breath, wondering what David was going to do next. David didn't hesitate. He knew that the truth had to come out, and it had to come out now. He stepped toward the altar where Father Michael stood, still rigid with fear and anger, trying to regain control over the situation. The priest's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously from David to the congregation, but he knew deep down that the secrets were no longer safe. There was no hiding now. David raised the metal box high, its cold surface reflecting the soft light that filtered through the church windows. "This," he said in a firm, unwavering voice, "is what your priest has been hiding from all of you." The congregation gasped, eyes widening in shock and confusion. They had all trusted Father Michael. Many had known him for years, had come to him for guidance, for confession. But now everything was being torn apart. The priest, once seen as a figure of peace and reverence, was now exposed as the mastermind behind a scheme that had been taking advantage of his own community. Father Michael recoiled slightly, his face a mask of disbelief and shame. "What is this madness, David?" he stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control. "You have no idea what you're doing. This is nothing but a misunderstanding." David didn't flinch. He opened the box slowly, allowing the congregation to see the stacks of money inside. Each bundle was carefully labeled with the names of people from the church, donors, parishioners who had entrusted their hard-earned money to a man they believed was serving God. The truth was clear now. Father Michael had been embezzling donations, pocketing the money for his own use. But there was more. "Do you think we're blind, Father?" David asked, his voice carrying through the room. "Hannah found this. She uncovered your secret. That's why you had her taken away. You knew she was about to expose you for what you truly are." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd, the weight of David's words sinking in. Father Michael's face went ashen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The priest was trapped, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before his very eyes. David's next words cut through the tension like a knife. "And you thought you could silence her. You thought that by locking her away, by making her disappear, no one would ever know the truth. But you were wrong, Father." Turning to Duke, David gave the dog a reassuring look. "Come on, buddy, let's finish this." They made their way quickly through the church, their footsteps echoing in the silence left behind by the chaos. David had no time to lose. He had already found the key and the map. Now it was time to finish what he had started. Together, they headed to the secret basement hidden beneath the church. David's pulse quickened with each step. He had no idea what he would find down there, but the urgency was undeniable. The truth was close, and so was Hannah's rescue. As they approached the small door hidden behind the altar, David could feel the weight of the moment. His hand gripped the key tightly as he inserted it into the lock. A faint click echoed in the air as the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. With only the flicker of his flashlight to guide them, David and Duke made their way down. At the bottom of the stairs, they were met by a damp, cold corridor. The only light came from a single bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the stone walls. David's breath caught in his throat as he heard a faint noise, the sound of chains moving, followed by a weak whisper. His heart pounded in his chest. "Hannah?" David whispered, his voice barely audible. He moved toward the sound, his flashlight beam dancing across the room. And there, chained to a chair, sat Hannah, pale and weak but very much alive. David's breath left him in a rush as he approached her, his eyes wide with disbelief and relief. "Hannah, you're alive!" he exclaimed, his voice full of emotion. She looked up at him, her eyes clouded with exhaustion and fear, but when she saw David, a flicker of hope sparked within her. "David?" she croaked. "You came. I knew someone would come." With trembling hands, David quickly worked to free her, cutting the chains with a knife he had found in his bag. As the last chain fell to the floor with a metallic clink, He helped her to her feet. She winced slightly, her legs unsteady, but she was alive. She was free. Before they could say another word, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall behind them. David spun around to find Father Michael standing at the entrance of the room, a look of fury in his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," the priest snarled, brandishing a wooden plank in his hands. "I told you. I warned you." David barely had time to react before the priest lunged at him, swinging the plank with all his might. David dodged to the side, but the blow grazed his shoulder, knocking him off balance. He stumbled, but before he could recover, Duke sprang into action. With a fierce growl, Duke lunged at Father Michael, sinking his teeth into the priest's leg. Father Michael cried out in pain and tried to shake Duke off, but the dog held on with all his strength, refusing to let go. David regained his footing and rushed forward, pulling the priest away from the dog. Father Michael struggled, trying to break free, but he was no match for David's strength. The priest fought desperately, but the truth was now exposed, and there was no escaping it. With Father Michael subdued and the police on their way, David turned back to Hannah, who was still weak but slowly regaining her composure. She looked at him with gratitude, her face streaked with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die down here. I didn't think anyone would find me." David gave her a soft smile, his heart swelling with relief. "You're safe now. You'll never have to be afraid again." David turned to the congregation, his voice steady and resolute. "This man, your priest, has betrayed you all. He's been stealing from the donations meant for the church. He orchestrated Hannah's kidnapping to keep his secret hidden, and today we've uncovered it all." A gasp of disbelief echoed through the church. Some people looked at each other in shock, unable to process what they were hearing. Others began to murmur, their suspicions about Father Michael now confirmed. The man they had trusted, the man who had led them in faith, was a fraud, a criminal who had used his position to deceive them all. David took a deep breath, his hand still gripping the box tightly. "I couldn't do this alone," he said, looking down at Duke, who was now sitting proudly beside him, his tail wagging. "It was this dog, Duke, who brought us the truth. He's the real hero here." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. The villagers, still stunned by the revelations, now began to see the loyalty and bravery of Duke, who had refused to leave Hannah's side, even in death. Father Michael was taken away by the police, still struggling against his restraints, his face a mask of disbelief. The villagers stood in stunned silence, watching as he was led away. The truth had come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. As Father Michael was hauled away by the police, the village of quiet secrets began to awaken. The once peaceful streets now hummed with a nervous energy, like the calm before a storm. Whispers swirled among the villagers, who could have imagined that their priest, the man they'd trusted, had been the architect of so much suffering. How had they been so blind to his actions? The tight-knit community, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a fragile house of cards, its foundations shaking with every revelation. David, standing outside the church, could still feel the weight of the truth he had unearthed. He knew that while this was a victory, the real work was only beginning. With Duke by his side, his loyal companion throughout it all, David couldn't help but think of the journey they'd been on together. It was Duke's instinct, his unshakable determination, that had led them to uncover the priest's hidden crimes. Without Duke, none of this would have been possible. The small crowd that had gathered in front of the church slowly began to disperse, but the tension remained thick in the air. Some were shaken, unable to process what had just transpired. Others, though, had already begun to plan for what came next. How would they rebuild? How would they regain the trust that had been stolen from them? There was a deep, unspoken need to heal, to restore not just their faith in the church, but in each other. David turned to the villagers, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made everyone listen. "This isn't over," he said. "There's still a lot of work to be done. But today, we've uncovered the truth. We have to stay strong. We have to rebuild together." Hannah, who had been silent until now, stepped forward from the crowd, her face pale but filled with resolve. She had been through so much, and yet her spirit was unbroken. She was finally free from the priest's grip, and while the road ahead would be long, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had come together to help her. "I'm grateful," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "But we all have to face what's happened. We can't let this dark chapter define us. We have to rebuild, starting with the truth." David nodded in agreement. He knew that the truth was the only foundation on which they could rebuild. But it wouldn't be easy. The village had been shaken to its core, and the healing process would be slow. Some would never fully recover from the betrayal. Some would leave, unable to reconcile the man they had once respected with the monster he had turned out to be. The next few weeks were filled with meetings, conversations, and difficult decisions. The church was closed for a time as the elders and community leaders took stock of what had been revealed. Financial records were examined, and Father Michael's crimes were laid bare. They had to ensure that everything was handled transparently, that no stone was left unturned. But even as the village grappled with the fallout from the scandal, there were signs of hope. David stayed in the village, determined to be a part of the rebuilding process. He worked with the elders to help restore the church's reputation, guiding the village through a process of deep reflection and rebuilding. The community had to heal, not just from the betrayal, but from the lies that had been woven so carefully into the fabric of their lives. Hannah, too, began to heal. She stayed in the village, supported by her newfound family. She worked closely with David to help organize support for those who had been hurt by the scandal, particularly the children who had once looked up to Father Michael as a mentor. Together, they helped those affected by the priest's manipulation to process their emotions and begin to move forward. David also knew that there was still one last piece of the puzzle to uncover. With the priest behind bars, the immediate danger had passed, but the full extent of his crimes had yet to be fully revealed. David's instinct told him that there was more to the story, more that the village needed to know. Determined to uncover the rest of the truth, David revisited the church's hidden storage room where he had found the stolen money and the map that led to the basement. He began to search for more evidence, piecing together the story of Father Michael's embezzlement and manipulation. With each new discovery, the weight of the priest's betrayal grew heavier. But David remained resolute. The truth had to be known, no matter how painful. As the months passed, the village began to recover. The scars were still there, and the trust that had been broken was not easily repaired. But there was a renewed sense of purpose in the air. The people were determined to rebuild their community, to restore the love and faith that had once bound them together. David's role in this process was not over. He continued to work alongside Hannah and the other villagers, helping them rebuild their faith and trust in each other. The road to healing was long, but with each step, the village grew stronger. They learned to rely on each other, to be open and honest, and to never again let the darkness of secrets and lies take root in their community. And Duke? Duke became a local hero, celebrated for his bravery and loyalty. Children who had once feared the dog now ran to him, eager to pet him and hear the story of how he had helped save the village from the evil that had been lurking within it. The dog had become a symbol of hope, of courage in the face of danger, and of the power of loyalty and truth. David, though weary, felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. The village was no longer the place of secrecy and fear it had once been. It was a place of healing, a place where the truth had been brought to light, and where the people could begin to rebuild their lives together.